Hey everybody. Just to give you an idea of where I'm at. I am in a mountainous, forested area where many people have vacation homes. It's cold here. There's a lot of trees, not a lot of activity. I'm not really sure yet what I'm going to talk about today. But there will be the occasional interruption by a vehicle or two. I'm just walking along a street. It's very windy and foggy here at the moment. And as usual, you're welcome to just listen. There's probably no particular reason to be watching my face unless you really enjoy doing that. So I have some training which I've received primarily through the auspices of my interest in Zen meditation. Which began, let's see, around 30 years ago now. When I read the life story of Musashi. This is a big, thick tome. It's not one of Musashi's books or the Book of Five Rings. Excuse me. It's a big, thick book. Still have the book that I got a long time ago. And in that book, there was a Zen priest who pretty much hated Musashi. And when Musashi was young, he was kind of a jerk and a coward and a bully. And so maybe at that point there wasn't that much to like about him. But the character of the priest, even though I didn't really like him, he wasn't a likable character in the book. He was just peculiar. And I had heard that there was a meditation practice. Of course, what I heard isn't actually really true. But I'd heard that there was a meditation practice where you were given a kind of a question that could not be resolved with the intellect. And I found that quite fascinating. And was very intrigued by it. And after reading the book, this was a time of deep spiritual seeking for me. I was living with a slightly monastically minded Catholic at the time. And every once in a while I have to step off the road just for safety. here. And he was introducing me to what might be called contemplative Catholicism. It's very different from your kind of everyday run-of-the-mill Catholicism. And I was singing very old liturgical music in a choir with Marilyn Thompson in Petaluma. I wonder if I can remember my roommate's name. Can't at the moment. It was a very peculiar and kind of beautifully souled man. His name was Jeff, actually. And he had the most astonishing voice. Oh my God. And he was very soft spoken. Big guy. Lovable. And he got me into the choir, and he took me up to a monastery up in Ukiah. Spent some time up there. A few times. I started undergoing the process to become a Catholic. I never finished that process. Strange, unexpected difficulties and ramifications of this emerged, which I'm not really intending to talk about today. But one of the most amazing things that happened to me during that time, there were a couple of amazing things. And one of them was that Jeff had kind of an in with a number of people who were, deep in the monastic Catholic tradition. And he got us an appointment to sit with 2 Carmelite nuns in a Carmelite monastery, which I think was in San Rafael or Novato, I can't remember. So we went through this, like, in general, these women are entirely sequestered. They're not allowed to have any contact really with the outside world at all, except through their priest. And these were 2 women in their 50s or 60s who had been in the monastery for many, many years. And we had to go through this, like a prison turnstile thing that led to a cage in which we had 2 seats on our side, they had 2 seats on their side. And we got to spend maybe an hour and a half with them, talking with them about questions of faith and the nature of God, and some of the mostly women, like Saint Teresa of Avila, some of the contemplative writers from that tradition. And while I don't particularly remember a lot of the specific conversation that day, there is something that will stand out about that day in my memory forever, which was that these 2 nuns, these women, there was a palpable aura of something otherworldly about them. Something really unlike anything I had ever encountered that I was aware of. They seemed to be glowing, not in the sense of giving off illumination, not in the sense of light was coming off of them, but the soul's version, the soul's metalogue of light was alive in them. And it was a really profound experience. The experiences that I had with the monks up at the monastery in Ukiah were good. I'm gonna have to turn around because it's starting to rain. I don't want to get soaked. And I'm probably gonna be laboring because I've been coming downhill and now I'm gonna be going uphill. So around this time, I remember a man I used to spend a lot of time in bookstores, and back at this time I had probably 4,000 or 5,000 books, almost all science fiction, but not all of it. Some few spiritual books and a little bit of philosophy and some novels. It's pretty fun in Nabokov, who I probably would have never encountered if it weren't for his appearance in a Sting song, What Don't Stand So Close. So around this time, just a second. I read the Musashi book, and a buddy of mine, my close guitar player friend, Rich Verone, who I met one day after an all-night LSD trip when I was 16 and he was 15. I met him on the street. I was carrying my guitar, and we became close friends, and I looked up to him as a guitar player for most of my life, still do. He was a huge inspiration to me. He was studying with a Buddhist teacher, and he began to talk to me about this idea of Zen koans. The word koan, as I understand it, I'm not an expert on any of this, it apparently means something like a public case or a public record, a matter of record. And the koans, there are hundreds of them in books. And there have been situations where, because Zen is so... The history of Zen is very complex and rich, with astonishing characters, peculiar characters, enigmatic characters. And Zen itself is a kind of standing enigma for the common person. We use this word colloquially to mean sort of clarity or austerity or minimalism. But Zen emerges from an incredibly minimalist approach to mindfulness and something we might refer to as awakening or Satori, Kensho, deep insight into the nature of the mind and the essence of being, which is, in Zen, often somewhat confusingly presented as emptiness. This emptiness does not really mean... It's very unfortunate. Our lexicon in English is insufficient, I think. Of course, many people who have spent long years in Zen study might simply say something like, that toward which Zen points is not verbally accessible. Huh? It is beyond the capacities of language to encompass or reasonably point toward. This doesn't mean we can never speak of it or we should never speak of it. It might mean, though, that if we are going to speak of it responsibly, we will be very careful and attentive. And we will avoid common traps of language and naming and thinking, and perhaps try to be a little more creatively present in the moment, aware of its opportunities, resistant to its pitfalls. So around this time, I'll return to topics of Zen, perhaps. But around this time, I ordered this book at the bookstore where I often went. It was Copperfield's in Santa Rosa. And a man named Ishmael Ford was working there. Older, peculiar, eccentric, intellectual Zen student. And I ordered this book, the book about Musashi's life. And it was a good book. And it came, and I read it. And I was deeply impressed by it. At the time, I was also studying Taekwondo with one of my friends, Chris Nelson. And he was also teaching me whip chain, which is a terrifying weapon to practice. Much more frightening than nunchucks in its way. And that's part of why I selected that weapon, is because it was so frightening to try to play with it. It's 7 metal links of chain, though there can be more. And I was using a practice chain, which is relatively light, but a war chain is extremely heavy. It probably weighs, 35 to 45 pounds. Anyway, it's a bunch of metal bars linked together, thin metal bars linked together with rings. It's got a handle at one end and a metal spike at the other end that's a little heavier than the bars. And you put flags on it to slow it down. You spin it around you and twist it and redirect it with your body and do all kinds of crazy things. And I was very excited about that study. So because of this, I was interested in Asian culture, and particularly Japanese culture, and was interested in martial arts. And there's a mindset of meditation that most martial arts will have some degree of, association with, right? Either you will meditate before you practice, or your teacher will teach you some aspect of mindfulness training to practice. Because many of the martial arts that we know today originated in hearing birds I haven't heard before. They originated in Asia in unusual situations. For example, there was a time in China when I think the ruler of the land sent his soldiers to obliterate the Buddhist temples. And armed horsemen attacked essentially unarmed monks. And these monks developed techniques to repulse soldiers with little or no weaponry. And as they did not have horses, they invented the whip chain. The whip chain was a weapon designed to be able to strike and kill or dismount an armed soldier. So, martial arts and meditation traditions go way back. So I ordered this book, I read it, I was very interested in pursuing martial arts and some kind of mindfulness training and in learning kanji. And I was making some furtive efforts in those directions. At the same time, I was being introduced to contemplative Catholicism and an entirely new tilt on a mode of Christianity. I was young, I was curious, I was inspired. So I remember going back into, I remember reading Musashi and thinking that I really wanted to study Zen. And so probably what I'd have to do is sell all my stuff, move to Japan, and go to a temple. Could have happened. A couple times in my life I had inspirations like this. Like, just get the hell out of the United States, go somewhere crazy, learn something amazing, live. What ended up happening instead was I stayed here and learned some amazing things, and though I didn't exactly thrive, I was nonetheless enriched. So I went back to the bookstore, and after reading the book, and Ishmael said, what'd you think of Musashi? And I said, I was really impressed with it, and I was particularly interested in the figure of the priest. Though Musashi's fascinating because he sort of redeems himself and becomes a mythically skillful swordsman, and then sort of gives that up. And by the way, in case it isn't obvious, those guys like the gunslingers of the Old West, there's a very clear correlation, right, between the mindsets of the quick draw cowboys and the samurai swordsmen. A challenge would be issued, and thereupon, with great immediacy, most often, and little fanfare, two men would face off and depend on their skillfulness to defeat their opponent and win a claim, as though a claim were something worthy of winning. Though I don't think it was a claim that drove many of those battles, it was something deeper, and perhaps there's no easy language about it. Musashi became a terrifying swordsman. He killed one of the men who was known far and wide as unbeatable, kind of a demon, a sort of evil man who took great pleasure in effectively murdering his opponents. The story goes that Musashi didn't even bring his sword to the encounter, which took place on an island. With his little knife, he apparently carved a striking stick from one of his oars, approached the swordsman, who was shocked and humiliated that Musashi was a mess and didn't bring a sword. And Musashi just killed him with a stick. And apparently, the guy was good enough that he got a strike off and maybe took off Musashi's top knot. I'm not sure how relevant this is to my story today, but it's okay. I don't have to be perfect. And I'm not in combat with anybody. And if there's any conflict at all, it's with this mountain and my inner critic, who's a pretty fierce guy, by the way, once he gets set up. Musashi later put up his sword, and we must imagine he had many unusual practices that while he lived on the land allowed him to sharpen his abilities to an uncanny degree. It's also likely he had teachers. If you're going to fight with katanas and stuff, well, one of the correlations, right, is the quick draw, because there are aspects of swordplay where one trains to slay an unexpected opponent who one cannot hear approaching from a seated position, to both draw the sword and kill in a single stroke. And this is the one of the correlations between the samurais and the gunslingers, right? Because it was the quick draw. Yeah. Now, not all swordplay was like that. Often people would draw swords face off and then, engage. But it generally wasn't, it was not a protracted form of combat, generally speaking. Usually with one or two encounters, a victor would be obvious and the loser would be either dead or severely injured. The wind is very loud here. It's kind of beautiful, spooky. Although there's roads and houses everywhere and cars and stuff. So Musashi put up his sword eventually and he became a gardener. He had a little hut. And people would come to challenge him and he refused them, I think. This went on for quite some time, and then maybe he picked up the sword again for a while in the latter part of his life, if I remember correctly. But there was an aspect after he had mastered the sword where he settled down into what appears to have been a contemplative existence. So I went back to the store where I bought the book, and Ishmael said, "Hey, what did you think?" And I said, that Zen priest is pretty interesting. The book is great. Musashi's fascinating. I think I'm thinking about selling my belongings and going to Japan to study Zen. And he said, "Well, you could do that. Or you could come back here in an hour and a half when I get off work. And we can walk up the street about 2 blocks from here. And I'll introduce you to my Zen teacher." And I was like, "Oh, wait, what? Really?" He's like, "Yeah." I said, "A real Zen teacher?" And he said, yeah. It's an Australian guy, John Tarrant Roshi, student of Robert Aitken Roshi, who gave John Tarrant transmission, meaning that John Tarrant Roshi, who was an American man, a brilliant, beautifully hearted human being, who taught Zen for many, many years in Hawaii, who acquired his Zen training in a Japanese prison camp in World War II. John Tarrant Roshi passed away in the first decade of the 2000s, I think maybe around 2006 or 8, if I remember correctly, which I may not. I got to meet him one time. And I think I was unceremonious about it. After dinner, we had a moment when I thanked him for his teachings, and I was quite choked up, and he offered his hand to me to shake it, and I embraced him. Probably an extreme decorum violation there. But I realized I'm gonna have one shot, and I really wanna hug this guy. So I wasn't particularly paying attention to propriety. So that night, we went to John Tarrant's house, and I sat Zen for the first time in his relatively small living room with his then wife, Roberta Goldfarb. And I met that night another young guy not too unlike myself, who had practiced kickboxing and had been a student of Zen for quite a number of years already. He was about my age. His name was Glenn Friedman, and he and I became relatively close friends. And I began my Zen practice, and I was extremely enthusiastic. I found the practice fairly difficult. You sit on a little pillow, on a little mat. Mat's called a zabuton, pillow's called a zafu. And your butt's sort of raised up on that pillow. You keep your back straight. You sit in half lotus or full lotus position. You have a mudra, which you hold around your belly button, where there's one version for the women, one version for the men, and it's just which four fingers cup the other four fingers, right? Is it the left cupping the right above them, or is it the right cupping the left? And then your thumb tips are just very gently touching. So, it makes kind of this is half of it. Can't show you the other half right now. So I began my Zen training, and I was profoundly determined to resolve the koan I was given, which is the koan mu. It is said that to begin the path of Zen study, you have to pass through the gateless gate of the old masters. Mu is this gate. There is no gate, yet you must somehow pass through. The koan itself is relatively simple. The framing of the koan is simple. So, long ago, there was a great Zen teacher named Joshu, or Chaochu in Chinese, and one of the declarations associated with the Buddha is that all beings are intrinsically complete or already perfected. There is nothing lacking in them. In this sense, they are the Buddha. Each being is the Buddha. The gnat, the tiger, the elephant, the fir tree, the turtle, the frog, the snake, the scorpion, the eagle, the vulture, the duck, the bear, the badger, the bison, the elephant, the giraffe, the coyote, the wolf, the sparrow, the mouse, the rat, the ferret, the cat, the dog, the lizard, the butterfly, the praying mantis. These are all faces of the Buddha. Now it is different. Perhaps it is different. Perhaps we can distinguish between the fact of intrinsic, essential perfection. We can distinguish between that fact and the capacity to realize that perfection, to have a direct experience of the awareness of that truth, and a peculiarly personal experience for each one who experiences this. And this is one of the results of dedicated meditation practice. And one might say, inappropriately, that although Zen should not be held to have a goal, because another one of the Buddha's declarations is, there's nothing to accomplish. In the Great Heart Sutra, it says there is no path, there's no awakening. It's a beautiful sutra that I recite now and then. So yeah, Zen sort of, in our deepest experiences of Zen, distinctions disappear. There's no mind, no me, no eye, no ear, no tongue, no body, no self. But this kind of talk is very mysterious until one has had some sort of taste of it. Yeah. And by the way, that when I say that, yeah, that's a habit I picked up from my Zen teacher, Jean Tarrant, many, many years ago. He would do this, and that's where I got that habit. I'm not doing it consciously, just unconsciously. So the koan, in the koan mu, there's a little story, right, that goes with it, which is that Joshu was walking with some monks. I think traditionally pictures and stuff show paintings of this. They show 3 monks, and the monks were a little ways ahead of him, and they were gathered around a dog. And this probably took place in China. And in China, at least at this time and maybe to this day, dogs were thought of kind of as vermin, right? They would think of dogs the way city dwellers might think of rats, which is unfortunate, actually, because mice and rats are some of the most courageous and intelligent creatures on earth. They're not much like our... They only very modestly resemble the ideas that modern humans generally have about them. And in fact, you know, I've often said that if you really want to see an example of courage, don't look at the tiger, who's, you know, gigantic, powerful, decked out in weapons. Look at the mouse. I mean, the mouse people have faced death in every unimaginable way that we could never imagine. Our species has been inventing new ways to subject mice to death for, tens of thousands of years, but certainly for the last 1,000, when they become test subjects in our laboratories, the mice probably know more about death than any animal on Earth, because they're just consistently subject to it. Often at the hands of humans, but even without us, they're a primary prey animal for many predators. So I would say, the mice are really good examples of courage, or the little sparrows that live in the cities and face gigantic automobiles and human beings and buildings and ridiculous, actually alien nonsense, like science fiction-y, impossible craziness that has nothing to do with being an animal at all. I think of these small creatures as my teachers, and I have great reverence for them. I haven't always been able to be as ethically true to my reverence for living beings as I would like. I have made mistakes that are terrible, and some of them haunt me on a few occasions. Most of them were thankfully unintentional. In any case, the monks approached a dog in the path, and they were gathered around the dog, and they were arguing about whether the Buddha meant, what did the Buddha mean when he said, all beings evince true nature. And in English, this is often sort of mispronounced. Sorry, looking at something here. It says, because we have the container metaphor and the possession metaphor, you might hear something in English like, all beings possess true nature. It's a bad, it's a linguistic misapprehension, because true nature is not a possession. There's a golf ball here. I'm gonna roll it down the street just to watch it go. It's a pretty big hill. Oh, I think its journey has ended for the moment. So, the monks were arguing. This is a dog. Did the Buddha really mean that the dog is the same thing as the Buddha? Is the dog and the Buddha, are these interchangeable? I mean, what did he mean? Surely he didn't mean this disgusting, cur is the same as the Buddha. What did he mean? Is this dog and the Buddha, are these the same? Are we looking at the Buddha right here? And so, Joshu, the old man, it said of him, I think, that a kind of light used to play around his lips when he spoke. And if you've ever encountered somebody like the sisters, the Carmelite sisters I mentioned earlier, or someone who's very deeply spiritually accomplished, you'll understand something of this. But we have many stories of the old Zen masters that are peculiar and, as I said, enigmatic and mysterious and beautiful and puzzling. So Joshu walked up to the monks, and they were arguing, and I said, Master, teach us, because we don't understand. I mean, does this dog have Buddha nature? Again, there's that possession, right? Does this dog evince the Buddha? Is this the Buddha in front of us right here or not? And in the koan, Joshu says, moo. Which apparently in Japanese means no. One of the monks, at that very moment when Joshu said moo, one of the monks awakened to his true nature. And so the koan is a record of an exchange in which either someone experienced awakening or there was a kind of dharma combat, insight combat going on between two teachers, or a teacher and a student, or a student and a teacher, so on and so forth. And there are hundreds of koans. Generally it is required for a Zen teacher in our lineage, I think, to resolve 300 koans. Most of them start with one of a very small number of koans. Mu is very common, that's the one that was given to me. And I thought, boy, I'm gonna break right through this right away. That never happened. 30 years later, still working on Mu. But I learned to sit and to follow my breath with my attention. One of the interesting things about Zen is it's extremely no frills. Although you can find literature and books written about it and so on and so forth, the practice is extremely simple. There is no real dogma other than maybe awakening is possible. And because it's associated with Buddhism, some of the traditional ideas and chants and so on, like the Great Heart Sutra, are preserved in Zen practice, so that before we sit as a group, we often have some chanting. We might recite the Heart Sutra or a number of other sutras. We have the great vows. The many beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Greed, hatred, anger, and ignorance rise endlessly. Fear, I vow to cut them off. The gates to awakening are countless. I vow to recognize and open them. The way of awakening is unsurpassed. I vow to embody it fully. These are the four vows that we normally take before sitting. So I learned something of mindfulness over many years of meditation. I sat first with the group, but eventually there was a conflict within the group that hurt my feelings and I left. I continued my practice on my own for a number of years until I came to San Francisco, and then I began to sit with another of Aiken Roshi's students, Joseph Bobro, and I met another young guy there who I became friends with and roommates with, a guy named Nick, and continued practice for a long time. And eventually there was kind of a crisis in that little group, and it sort of broke up, and I stopped sitting for a while, started sitting again eventually, so on. My point is just that Mindfulness training helps us to be present in the situations we are in, regardless of the activity of the mind. Yeah? We notice the mind is churning, it has desires, it has fears, it's impatient, it's frustrated, it's frightened, it's megalomaniacal, it's all these things, right? The mind is doing all these things. But in mindfulness training, we learn to return to the breath and just to return our awareness to that fundamental pulse of life within us that consciousness arises from, the breath. Yeah. And although I didn't really have a goal today in making this video, eventually I thought I would speak about the usefulness of mindfulness training, because it's profoundly helpful and healthful, it's healing, if we are willing to stop, to allow the mind to settle, not to stop it, not to try to stop it, to allow it to settle down and to just feel the breathing pulse from which our life force and consciousness emerges. To let the attention rest in that inhalation and exhalation, and the little gap between each one, something very beautiful there. At the bottom of the exhalation, there's this resting place, and at the top of the inhalation, there's a resting place. Sometimes during my Zen training, I eventually had experiences where it seemed as though I was so relaxed that I mostly stopped breathing, or breathed only very little for quite some time. And of course, I've had a number of interesting experiences in sitting Zazen. That's not the point of my talk. In fact, many of those experiences can be quite distracting because they can seem very powerful or important. But the goal is to get past all of that, right? If there's a goal, the goal is to cut through the mind and experience directly one's true nature, one's original nature. However, in times of crisis and trouble, when we are frightened and the world, is becoming disorganized around us, and the routines we are used to are being broken, the routines we depend upon for calmness and sanity and well-being, the capacity to just sit down and follow your breath, and as your mind brings forth its produce, just let it settle again. And it may keep doing that, right? It brings forth something, you just settle back into the breath. Ah, yes, there's thinking. That's okay, back to the breath. Oh, yes, there's frustration. Ah, yes, back to the breath. Oh, yes, there's desire. Oh, back to the breath. Oh, fear, back to the breath. Right? Just keep returning to the breath or the koan, which for me is just mu, right? I just breathe in, mu. But I don't say it. It's in my, I say it in my belly. And we breathe in Zen by sort of expanding the lower belly, right? Down, let's see here. Like in here, yeah? So you relax your belly first so that it's kind of a big baby belly, totally relaxed. And then you just let it expand for the inhalation and contract for the exhalation. Your belly kind of goes in and out. Rather than breathing up in your chest, you're breathing down in your belly. And there's the idea of moving your consciousness, your awareness down into your belly, which is sort of primordial. Yeah. Our organs are down in there, our digestive system, our stomach, our spleen, liver, kidneys, all that stuff is all down in there. So we want to kind of come away from the head, where a lot of us live, right? We're up in our head a lot of the time, particularly if we're frightened or nervous or frustrated. And just go down into the belly and breathe. and feel that breath. Let your awareness attach to that rhythm of expanding and contracting. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's very powerful, very calming. In fact, even just talking about it right now is very calming for me. So in times of difficulty, it's very important to take a few minutes. You know, we usually, Zen periods are usually either 25 minutes or 40 minutes, I think. And then we walk for 10 minutes. We do walking meditation, which is called kinhin, which is, and by the way, when we do Zen, the gaze is sort of directed down and the eyes are half lidded like this. Gaze is directed down, eyes are half lidded. You don't pay attention to anything that you see, really, or what happens with your visual sense. But you also neither keep your eyes open, right? Because it's something that is somewhat comfortable to me. I just keep my eyes open. And nor do you close them, right? And the reason for that is just that in Zen we are trained not to fall into trance. And with your eyes wide open, it's easy to fall into trance. And with your eyes closed, it's easy to fall asleep or, fall into trance. And in Zen practice, we want to retain the kind of sharp edge of the awareness, in a sense, so that we can be aware of bodily sensations, we can be aware of transformations in consciousness, and we can just keep returning to the breath and the practice throughout the period. And once you sit down, you stay there, right? You don't sit down for 25 minutes and get up after 10. Right? You sit down for 25 minutes, you sit down for 40 minutes. But for common people who are just wanting to get some benefit of mindfulness training, you can sit for 5 minutes, you can sit for 10 minutes, a little longer if you become comfortable with it. And if this doesn't work for you, it's okay, right? You don't have to. I'm not trying to tell people, hey, you should sit meditation. But if you find that you're nervous or you're frightened or the world is becoming confusing, you're not sure, you feel uncertain, mindfulness training is a very valuable medicinal practice. It's good for your health. Your organs regenerate a little bit. You acquire, if you're doing it right, you acquire, if you're doing it well, you acquire like a regenerative energy from this practice. And whether or not we're going to sit meditation, attentive mindfulness is profoundly useful in situations of crisis and unexpected change. And my original teacher, John Tarrant, this is kind of one of his, this is a space that he likes to teach from, right? He might say something similar to, look, when things are in upheaval, when you don't know what's going on, when you're frightened, when everything's topsy-turvy, that's the most fruitful time to bring mindfulness into your awareness, to come back to the body, come back to the essential aspects of your being, recognize them, inhabit them, nurture them, express them. We're facing a time now of incredibly profound change. It's unpredictable, it's frightening. We can't really depend thoroughly on our society to carry us through this. And some of us are not going to come through this. So we're going to need to develop intelligent, skillful capacities with our awareness so that we can make decisions that make sense, so that we can relate with people meaningfully and kindly. Wow, the wind is really kicking up and getting wet. It's not raining, it's blowing moisture off the tree branches, and there's a lot of it because it's foggy. We're going to need good foundations to live and dream and work from. And we're not going to get those from like overthinking or listening to the news. We're going to have to, I think, or at least my view is, that we're going to have to bring to life the profound potentials, the beautiful and astonishing potentials that our modern humanity has largely buried under nonsense. And mindfulness is a very useful tool, a very useful practice that can help us to rediscover aspects of our ability, our resilience, our faith, our true nature. You don't have to solve a koan. You don't have to answer the question, does the dog have Buddha nature or not? And in fact, I think the koan is a bit of a trap. I'm not sure about this, but I come to think in my older age that the koan's a bit of a trap. It's a trap for the intellect. And in a way, it kind of keeps the intellect busy enough that the anciently profound nonverbal aspects of our being can emerge into our awareness while the intellect is busy in its little hamster wheel of yes or no, black or white, good or bad, so on and so forth. So I've meandered around these topics quite a bit, and I'm grateful to have this time to record this video for those of you who may enjoy it at some point in the future. I adore the living world. These trees, this fog, the mist, the birds, the animals and plants, they are what I live for. I'm also a human being, and so I live in that world too. And sometimes for me it's very confusing because I don't trust the humans really much at all. I don't trust what they call intelligence. What they call society does not seem particularly social to me. What they call civilization does not seem civilized. What they call education rarely approaches anything I would conceive of as resembling what the word could mean if we lived in societies that were even modestly enlightened. So in many ways, we're kind of, in my view, in a new dark age. It's a dark age of technology. It's a dark age of too much light, too much fake light, right? And I don't like those lights. I can't stand the brightness of LEDs. The shivery white terror of modern lighting is a nightmare to me. Give me something soft. Give me something warm. Give me something like sunset or the sunlight itself. But all these machines and screens and glaring white illuminants, it's not my it's not something I relate with. I retreat from all of that stuff to the degree that I'm able, even though in this time much of our lives and communication and such depends on these things, ironically. I mean, I'm here making a video on my smartphone, right? The irony is not lost on me. In any case, I send you all my love, my hope for your well-being, and I retain my reverence for the living world and my curiosity about the path of our species in the strange situation, in the vast array of strange situations that we presently inhabit. Thank you for joining me. All blessings to you.